My name is Jennifer Gray Thompson, and I am the CEO of After the Fire. Welcome to the podcast, How to Disaster: Recover, Rebuild, and Reimagine. In this podcast, we bring you the very best practices, best hearts, and great ideas from other disaster-affected communities. Thank you for joining us. Welcome back to the podcast. Today, I'm excited to welcome to the show Chisato Fukuda Calvert. She is the interim director of OpenAQ, an environmental tech nonprofit dedicated to advance science, impart policy, and empower people to fight air pollution. Of note, Chisato is also on the board of directors for After the Fire. 1 out of every 8 deaths in the world can be attributed to poor air quality, particulate matter in the air, pollution from industry, agriculture, transportation, and construction. All of these can greatly impact all of us across the world, but especially at-risk communities. OpenAQ believes that everyone should have access to clean air, which is why we are thrilled to hear from Chisato on the show today. Wildfires in particular negatively impact the air quality in not only the region, but also across the country. Today, Chisato is going to share with us some data that actually really starkly illustrates how a wildfire on the West Coast can actually have impacts across the country and even the globe. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us today on the show, and welcome Chisato Fukuda Calvert. We're so happy to have you. So once again, thank you, Chisato. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Jennifer. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
This is a special honor for me because I've actually met you maybe 3.5, almost 4 years ago, right after our wildfires in Sonoma County. And at the time, you were working for another organization, also with a great social impact message. And I was very honored to be invited to sit with you and other disaster leaders in New Orleans for 3 days, and really to talk about some of the issues around equity and disaster, around service delivery and disaster, the role of emergent leadership. And I really came out of that experience enjoying everybody I had met, but with full transparency, you became my favorite. And in part because, like, when you shared the story and the photo of your mother and your origin story and all that you've accomplished in your life. And so I do want to totally dive into your current work with OpenAQ and how that relates to wildfire disaster. But if you don't mind, I would love for you to talk a little bit about your journey in your life for how you got here today.
Sure, yeah, happy to. I am a first-generation Japanese American. I grew up in a suburb in New Jersey, but I spent my childhood actually toggling between Japan and New Jersey. So I think growing up, I had to really navigate 2 different cultures and 2 different languages. And because of that, I really had to learn pretty quickly to understand that cultural norms are different, to understand that systems are built differently for different people. And so I think that's what really prompted my interest in cultural anthropology. So that's actually what I pursued as an undergraduate at Bucknell University. And while I was studying cultural anthropology is actually also coincidentally my first lived experience with air pollution. So in 2006, I studied abroad in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, which is one of the most air polluted cities in the world. And I remember distinctly stepping out of the airport and I took in a deep breath and I immediately started coughing because of this really cold, unfamiliar, thick smog that I was breathing in. And the smell was very distinct, this cold, lingering smell. I couldn't shake it off of my jacket. It wouldn't cut off my clothes. And during that study abroad period, I lived with a host family in the capital city. And we frequently had to go to the district hospital because my host brothers were suffering from pneumonia. It was February at the time. It gets to -40 degrees Celsius Fahrenheit. It's actually when the temperature doesn't matter anymore, what centigrade it is or whether it's Fahrenheit. and my host mother was suffering from heart problems. And so this, having this proximity to air pollution in that way and understanding how people are having to live with this reality was a really impactful experience for me. And during that time, I also understood very distinctly what the inequities around air pollution exposure were. Really, the only way to safeguard your health was to leave the city and live in the countryside for 3-4 months during the most polluted season, or if you can, leave the country and live in South Korea or Japan. So already, there are people who can, uproot their lives and go somewhere else for some time, and people who have to stay. And the people who have to stay, there's over 800,000 people in the capital city who have to burn raw coal to stay warm. And obviously the international community will claim that coal is polluting, but coal is also survival for a lot of these communities. And so I really tried to understand sort of this paradoxical notion of the economy and politics, the culture around air pollution. So I kept going back. So I went back in 2010, 2012, and then I conducted my ethnographic research 2014 to 2016 when I pursued my PhD in medical anthropology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And during that study is when I really did a deeper dive into the structural understanding of the power dynamics, understanding local perceptions and why that's important, how to craft, research questions in a way that provides a comprehensive assessment about air pollution. And so when I was back in Ulaanbaatar in 2014 to 2016, I would work alongside coal workers who are obviously most exposed to the air pollution given their occupation and being outside during the high peak hours, actually handling the raw coal itself and it staining their hands. I worked with scientists who were, from more afar, but really assessing the pollution levels and understanding mitigation strategies. I worked with politicians who were really trying to push for policy change and understanding kind of the dynamics there. I also worked with a lot of residents. I worked with pregnant women who were dealing with pregnancy loss because of air pollution exposure. So I think that ethnographic look into how complex the air pollution problem is was really important because it's not a symptom, it's really a structural problem. And we really need to think big picture about what are the underlying forces that are perpetuating these inequities. And it was actually in 2015 when I crossed paths with Krista Hasenkop and Joe Flasher, who are the co-founders of OpenAQ. They held their first ever OpenAQ community workshop in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, when I was there. And so I was asked to participate, and I was in a room with software developers, air quality advocates, scientists, journalists who really wanted to use data. And that's where I really learned the value of open air quality data and how pivotal it is to help shape particular air quality initiatives. And that's sort of my introduction to the organization itself. And I was lucky enough a few years after completing my PhD, I reconnected with Krista, and that's sort of how I kind of re-emerged, I guess, in connecting with OpenAQ as an organization. Yeah, since 2019, I've been with the organization, and I currently serve as the interim director of OpenAQ and really support on business development, on partnership development and strategy. And I feel very lucky that we also reconnected, Jennifer, because I think really being part of the community after the fire as a new, board of director member, I think really helps to shape the understanding there's a lot of work to be done around air quality. It's not something that is just happening in New Delhi. It's not just something happening in Mongolia. It's something that we're all dealing with here in the US. And with the proliferation of wildfires, with the increasing effects of climate change year after year, wildfires is absolutely our new reality. And we need to adapt our strategies as a nation to really address this. And so I hope that I can play my part in bringing air quality and equity to the forefront. So thank you so much.
You are, well, thank you, because I specifically, you had been on my mind for at least a year when I was really revisioning what after the fire would look like and remissioning it. And I had mentioned it to you a couple of times softly, a little soft intro, feeling you out. But one of the things that I love that you bring to the table is not only the issue of highlighting and amplifying the issue where air quality meets equity and how wildfire affects that, but also your experience with understanding how to navigate an ecosystem of trying to look at a systemic issue that we can actually tackle. We can deal with air quality, we can deal with mega fires, but you really have to be able to sit at at the table with politicians, with policymakers, which are, which means staff of politicians, and people who have very maybe divergent points of view, biases. You have to, see them from their own cultural standing, which we have a lot of cultures even in the United States. We need that kind of talent and that kind of willingness to depoliticize as we change policy. And the compassion when you mention, which just struck me, of standing alongside people who were the coal miners essentially, and that their hands would be colored by the coal, and the true empathy and compassion that it's the same in wildfire, like the blaming part of it and the deciding that if you live in the woods, you're the problem. If you don't vote the way I like, you're the problem. And suddenly all these people should, just either disappear off the face of the earth or move to an underpass in a suburban or urban area. And we push back on that because we believe that we have to collaborate. This issue is so big. And can you talk about what that was like from a learning perspective when you were sitting in that space and holding all those points of view and looking at the systemic issue?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it was very, it kind of, for me, illuminated how important it is to have an outsider perspective or someone who is not from within the community look into the issue and kind of connect the dots. Because I think, especially for those who are suffering from pollution, and I think the same with people who have lost their homes, who are really, I mean, secondary, third, trauma from disaster, there really isn't a space or community to heal. And so there's really no space to also make those connections. And so I think that's where, as an anthropologist, it was my responsibility to understand what the gaps were, and also kind of listen to what those gaps are, and the skills that I've gained around exactly what you're saying, like how important compassion and empathy are, and trust building is so critical. And so in the work that I did, I had to ensure that I was proficient in Mongolian. I conducted all of my research in the Mongolian language. My surveys were also designed in Mongolian. We had to make sure that everyone understood, the urgency of the air pollution problem. And it is really challenging to really try to bring people together and really see that this is something that's going to affect not just your lifetime, but for generations to come. So yeah, it's absolutely a necessity.
And there's something really lovely that is striking to me that you did that you reported out in Mongolian and did your surveys in Mongolian. And I think there's a lot of transferable skills into wildfire that often when we do talk about wildfire, we're going to have, more of an academic discussion today for sure. But it can be alienating for some people to really, they're like, I just want to talk about like, how do I keep my house safe and how do I not like run for my life and lose everything? And language can also be a barrier to equity. And so to have that, to work, it had to be so much harder, let's be honest, to do it in Mongolian than in English. There is just no way that wasn't far more difficult. So can you talk about that process of you making that sort of bicultural, bilingual decision?
Yeah, I mean, I can't take full credit in the actual, idea or pursuit. It was a requirement for my program,
Okay.
but it did take years of learning. I took basically all of my summers I dedicated to taking coursework in the Mongolian language. I did a lot of virtual coursework as well with Indiana University, as well as at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I had to also build, relationships with teachers and others on the ground in Mongolia to help to facilitate that as well. And so it really is about relationship building. One thing I also wanted to mention was, and it struck me because you mentioned sort of the politics around wildfires and how people have different agendas and people talk about it in different ways. It's very similar with air pollution and my experiences in Ulaanbaatar, because this is a country that has recently in the past few decades transitioned from a Soviet regime to a democratic regime. And during the Soviet Union, a lot of the public health campaigns were very much top down. And really regulated, centralized in a way that was very effective and very direct. I think that when a country is undergoing such big transitions, such as a democratic transition, and really opening up the markets and really, coal being a driver of the economy, it's really difficult. The political agenda of politicians is to keep the coal economy running because it's incredibly profitable and it's one of the biggest, producers of the GDP in the country. And I think working with the coal workers day to day was kind of a reminder of, people are not doing this because they think it's polluting, right? It's literally to make a couple dollars, if that, for the week.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think really understanding that disparity and kind of rather than thinking about it as numbers or statistics, it's really important to think about these are people's lives. And these are people who are trying to make ends meet. And these are families who are continually putting themselves in harm's way to protect their families. And so I think that what you're saying about compassion should be the central work in any kind of disaster work.
I think it absolutely has to be that you're holding the people affected and the people traumatized the center of all of your work. And it's really though, and I like that you immediately said, hey, I can't take credit for doing all the Mongolian thing. That was a requirement, but I think it takes a lot of courage to have systemic change that is collaborative and not a zero-sum game, and to look at it as a choreographed evolution where people are willing to set aside their sort of desire to dominate a space in service to a greater mission. That because you can win, but if you win, then are the people in front of you, are they winning or are you winning? And which is more important to you? And I know in disaster, I run into that pretty consistently is some people are like super into collaborating and other people are super not into it. And I am always sort of flummoxed by the latter, because I'm like, but what are we here for? Like, we're here to actually help the people in front of us. Anyway, so I do I do look forward to having those conversations with you as a board member and sort of helping me walk through some of the more those difficult conversations or those difficult moments to get to the other side. Because sometimes I just turn into an 8-year-old and I'm like, but why are you being so mean? Like let's make, it's hard. Like let's do the hard work together so that we can actually create lasting, impactful change that really lessens suffering, because that's the business that we're in. We are here to lessen and mitigate suffering and just make it a little bit better. And no one is doing this on their own.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
None of it works that way. So one of the things that I asked you is if you wouldn't mind taking us through some of your slides. Now, if you're listening to this on the podcast, on the Audible, Chisato is really good at actually verbalizing what's in front of you, but we are going to drop her slide deck into the links as well. And you can also find it on our YouTube page. Or this may be one of the episodes that you would rather use, take a look at it on YouTube. I was just really struck by the actual data. I don't hear enough in the conversations about wildfire, about the critical piece of air quality. And if I could just quickly tell us a little story that I know that on October 8th in 2017, when, our world changed here forever. So there's before the fire and there's after the fire. And I had been up all night, really like helping my sister evacuate or check whatever it was. And it was like a bit of a horror show, but it wasn't until the morning when I looked up into the sky about 5 a.m. and I really saw this orange hazy glow, and I really understood. And I was driving in my car to go to the shelter, and I thought, I wonder if I should be wearing a mask. And then I was like, where am I to get one of those? And I called a guy from a local hardware store and that I know, and I was like, Alan, do you have any masks? And then he's like, I have 8 masks left, Jennifer. And I was like, I'll take them all. And I thought I would go and just give them to people. And he's like, I can't do that, Jen. I can give you one and I'll give it to you. And then I understood that masks were a huge, it's not part of a disaster. It's part one. It's step one in a disaster. Mm-hmm. Is if you cannot breathe, you cannot get this work done. You will not be able to sit outside for long. You have to wear a mask in your car, even because you choke on smoke and you do it for days. So until I had experienced a disaster, it had honestly never occurred to me. We have 2,000 N95s in our office, should that ever come up. Thank you, FEMA, by the way. So I just wanted to put that out there that I had no idea before 2017 that this was that kind of very basic primary issue. So, because I'm fortunate to live in a place like Sonoma Valley where we normally have fantastic air quality. So let's do that. Anyway, Chisato, we're going to take a quick break before you share your slides, and I'll let you go ahead and set up your share screen. And we will be back in just a moment with Chisato. I'm going to get this wrong. Chisato Fukuda Calvert. I've been working on this, and she is the interim director of Open AQ and a board member at After the Fire and a friend. So stay with us. Thanks.
This podcast is sponsored by Fire Safe Signs. In a disaster, seconds matter. Fire Safe Signs give first responders critical information like, can a fire truck make it down the driveway? What water sources are available? Fire Safe Signs help property owners provide crucial information to first responders, and they're made in the USA. Getting this information in seconds helps save lives. Together, we make our community safe. Visit us today at firesafesigns.com.
Welcome back to the podcast. We are here once again with the Open AQ interim director, Chisato Fukuda Calvert. And apologies because for some reason, I'm just always stumbling there. My apologies. Anyway, one of the things I've asked her to do is to actually share some slides. Again, if you're listening to this on Apple or Spotify or any of the other places where it's hosted, she's excellent at actually verbalizing what you're seeing, but we are going to drop the slideshow into the information. I do encourage you, if you're very interested, to go ahead and go over to our YouTube channel and watch at least this part of the episode. We'll put a marker in it so it's easier to find. And I'm going to turn it over. Chisato.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, I just wanted to take this opportunity to share a little bit more about air quality, health, and equity, particularly tailoring it to the wildfire disasters that we're facing year to year here in the US. So just a big picture. So air quality really affects everyone. We actually breathe 2,000 gallons of air every single day. So that in terms of amount, it's if you imagine a size of a large pool, that's how much air we're breathing every day. So during a wildfire, what exactly are we breathing? So here's a diagram of PM 2.5, which is the main component of wildfire smoke. PM 2.5 is a really microscopic mixture of solid and liquid droplets. And it's so small that, as you can see, it's a tiny fraction of the diameter of a human hair follicle. So it's so small that when you're breathing it in through your nose or mouth, you can't actually sneeze or cough it out, because at that point, it's already deep within your human body. So it enters through your nose and mouth, through the lungs, and also can enter your bloodstream, which is really terrifying. So here's another image of a microscopic kind of comparison between a red blood cell and PM 2.5. So again, it's very, very small. And in large amounts, it's really detrimental to your health. So a few of the health effects from air pollution exposure of PM 2.5, it can trigger or aggravate asthma. It also decreases lung function. If you think about children who are still developing their lungs and their airways, they are most susceptible to decreased lung function. It also increases the risks of pneumonia and bronchitis, and also has cardiovascular effects as well. So heart attacks and those who are suffering from heart disease. And then for pregnant women and infants, really long-term PM 2.5 exposure also is really detrimental to fetal development in utero, and also causes low birth weight in infants. And not only respiratory and cardiovascular effects, but also affects cognitive decline. And so elderly are also susceptible to dementia. And of course, those who have these underlying heart and lung disease conditions are also susceptible to premature death. So here are some of the most at-risk populations. As I mentioned, children who are still developing their lung capacity, pregnant women, older people, people with underlying heart and lung conditions, people who have occupations who are exposed outdoors for a long period of time, especially during peak levels of wildfire smoke, and communities of color in the US due to some of the redlining practices that have established policies essentially putting people of color in neighborhoods that are in close proximity to high polluting industries. And communities of color also, because of this historic practice for decades, are disproportionately at risk of higher asthma and cardiovascular diseases, and lack of access to healthcare and resources as well. And just as a reference, and this is a study in 2003, and so it's a little bit outdated, but UC Irvine conducted a study in Southern California to really give a bigger picture of the health costs of wildfire smoke. And they found that over 770 hospitalizations, 1,400 emergency room visits, 48K outpatient visits, and 69 premature deaths were caused by wildfire smoke exposure. So this study really shows that there's a lot more space and a lot more need for studies like this, correlating wildfire smoke specifically with health outcomes. And there's a lot of evidence out there already about collecting some of the medical records that are available and making those studies possible. So just wanted to share that as a reference for those who are interested in really understanding the quantifiable effects of wildfire smoke on communities. To hone in a little bit more around the racial disparities of PM 2.5 exposure, people of color really are disproportionately exposed to high concentrations of PM 2.5. And where wildfire comes in is that it essentially exacerbates these pre-existing harms because of these underlying conditions. And so the communities of color will always be at higher risk of adverse health outcomes due to these structures that have been in place historically in the US. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the air quality index. You may have seen it in news channels. You may have, gone to airnow.gov and done your own research. But here is the AQI for the US. Every government actually has a different AQI based on different thresholds of air pollution exposure. So the AQI was really developed as a public communication tool for communicating daily air quality to the public. And it is an average of different pollutants, so ozone, PM2.5, PM10, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, and nitrogen dioxide. And there are different health concerns that are attached to different thresholds. So you'll see there's a range from good down to hazardous. And the higher the number, the greater the health concern. And during the Dixie Fire, Plumas County actually had an AQI of 834, which is clearly in the maroon 301 or higher threshold. And as a reference, New Delhi averages 450. So an AQI of 834 is really detrimental to one's health, especially if you're exposed to it for more than 1 or 2 days. I also wanted to show this map of the US. Each dot actually represents an air quality monitoring data source. So it's either a low-cost sensor or a reference grade monitor. But this is from the OpenAQ website. And these are measurements of PM2.5. And so based on the day of the year and time of the day, this will be a different gradient from blue to red being highly polluted. So as you can see, the reason why I wanted to show this is because there's a lot of air quality monitoring happening in the US, but there's also a lot of gaps in the middle of America and also even parts of the American West. And open data really is integral to try to develop interventions that are designed to mitigate air pollution and designed to safeguard one's health against wildfire smoke. So I wanted to really showcase the need for more air quality monitoring and the need for more open data so that people can be properly informed about the air that they're breathing. Another thing that really affects the health angle, particularly around wildfire smoke, is transboundary smoke. So wildfire smoke travels, it doesn't just concentrate in one location. So if there's a fire in Northern California, it doesn't stay within state boundaries. The wind direction and wind flow can really carry it to different parts of the country and even into other countries and across the ocean as well. And so I think this image developed by NOAA really helps to illustrate that there's quite a lot of different states that are affected by high PM2.5 levels. And it really is important to think about exposure to wildfire smoke more broadly than within state boundaries. So I wanted to also shift over to thinking about how we can actually safeguard our health when we're exposed to PM2.5 at high concentrations during wildfires. Here's an image of an N95 mask. So scientific studies have showcased that wearing an N95 mask properly actually reduces your exposure to PM2.5 by 95%. So it's a very high effectiveness, and really encourage those who are outside or having to spend a lot of time outdoors due to work, really to protect your health by wearing a N95 mask and stocking up as well and being able to distribute that to your community members. And of course, a lot of people don't really think about how air quality outside affects indoor air quality, but it does. It's about half of the PM2.5 levels will still linger in your home, just given that there's windows, there's insulation issues, and there's ways to actually have the PM2.5 trickle into your home. And so it's really important to think about how to protect indoor air. And the way you can do that is by purchasing an air filter. Air filters are 86% to 98% effective in reducing PM2.5 exposure. And I've listed, a few of the models that have been tested in the past and ranking their effectiveness. But this is the air filter actually that I had in my home. And this was probably for maybe less than a month's time. And as you can see, it is black. And so, just another way of visualizing the things that we're putting into our bodies and how important it is, where we sleep and where we play and where we eat. We want to be able to, especially for those who have children and young infants, it's really important to create a safe space for our families. And then lastly, just wanted to highlight some of the projects that we're working on. And one is forecasting PM 2.5 and wildfire events. This is through the Predicting What We Breathe project with the City of Los Angeles and NASA. And what we've done is collect ground monitoring air quality data that I mentioned in the map that I showed of OpenAQ, and we're combining it with satellite data produced by NASA as well as with wildfire data, and creating a predictive algorithm that actually produces a 9-day forecast. And this 9-day forecast is 95% accurate. And so here's a graph showing the ground truth with the actual forecasting predictions. And this is really valuable because what it allows us to do is allows city governments and federal governments to really provide an alert system or a federal level warning system for those who may be affected by wildfire smoke in the future. And there are ways that, and also be able to communicate the ways that you can safeguard your health by purchasing a Hepa filter, by purchasing masks. So this really opens up the possibility for different types of interventions, as well as for different types of scientific knowledge, production around the correlation between wildfire events and PM 2.5 exposure. So as just conclusion, some of the criteria to think about, or some of the things to think about when thinking about wildfires is it's not just the fire event itself, but thinking about the PM 2.5 levels, the people who are most affected by the PM 2.5 levels in a community, and then numbers of hospitalizations that are resulting from short-term and long-term exposure to wildfire smoke, and the percentage of people of color in low-income communities that are affected by wildfire smoke, as well as the percentage of states, because it's a transboundary issue, affected by wildfire smoke. And there are, proven effective interventions. There are ways that you can actually do pre-emergency funding to safeguard health. You can distribute distribute N95 masks. And there's ways to cover medical expenses incurred as a result of long-term smoke exposure. And of course, warning systems by using air quality forecasting. So I definitely encourage those who want to learn more, in the yellow box, I added a few, links there, or I guess, websites that you can actually search for more information around health and wildfire and air quality. So I hope.
And you can give, this is a good time to give the actual website for OpenAQ. We would love it if you do that.
Oh, sure. Yeah. For those who would like to visit OpenAQ specifically, please go to www.openaq.org. We also hope that you check out our YouTube channel. We have recorded webinars where we focus on different air quality related topics. And we have guest speakers and panelists contributing to those webinars. So definitely encourage you to join our YouTube channel as well. And we do have a monthly, not a monthly, it could be monthly, a quarterly newsletter that goes out as well. So we can share updates on projects and upcoming events as well. So it would be great for you all to join. And if you have any questions about air quality, or if you know of any air quality data sources that you want to share on the platform, that would be fantastic. And we'd love to connect with you.
Thank you. So let's go ahead and stop sharing screen.
There we go.
One of the things that occurred to me, watching this, because we were on a call with FEMA yesterday where you gave a very similar, we gave the same presentation, which is one of the reasons why I wanted you to repeat it today, is because I learned things, and some of them were uncomfortable. The particulate part, like I knew it was bad. I know I'm inhaling other people's lives and their furniture. And so you're inhaling grief, but you're also inhaling things that are clearly terrible for you. HEPA filters are very expensive. And so it seems like this would be another good opportunity for the healthcare industry and the insurance industry to say, from your HSA funds or whatever it is, if you needed 1 or 2 HEPA filters, that's $200 or $180. I mean, they are not inexpensive. And if they said, we will reimburse you for HEPA filters and also changing out the filters in your house and a certain number of masks, it seems like they would save money on the back end. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that would be an incredibly effective way of ensuring sustainable usage and encouraging people to have them in their homes. I think you're absolutely right. One of the biggest barriers to purchasing some of these safeguarding protective measures is cost. There are companies out there, and I'm happy to share, through email as well. There's companies like Smart Air that are producing more DIY or more cost-effective air purifiers, and they're proven to be just as effective as any of the big name brands. So there are companies out there who are trying to, provide them at a lower cost. But in terms of, making sure that there's a systematic mechanism for those, who are most affected in particular to have them in their homes, I think that's a very important way of ensuring that happens.
And I think it's an opportunity to actually do equity. You and I have had this conversation before. People, especially over the past 18 months, like to talk about equity. And a lot of people are really trying to do it, but how to actually do it and how to do it in ways that are relevant, that actually serve the end user as opposed to the person who's trying to feel better about equity. But what are actionable items we can do to increase access and equity, and even keeping it, having that be a reimbursable expense for universal health care too, under like the Obamacare. It should absolutely extend all the way throughout the program, because one of the things that we know is we are going to have to live with a certain amount of wildfire smoke because we have to have prescribed burns, especially in the American West. Mm-hmm. If we do not tolerate a certain number of bad air days, mm-hmm. that's how it's actually from Lomakatsi, from Marco Bay's organization. One of a scientist on his staff who said in a meeting, wildfire prevents wildfire. And we do need some wildfires, but we don't need mega fires, which is what we're experiencing now. Mm-hmm. So I would love to see a more tolerance for some days that are, especially during the winter months where we have not good air quality days, but that we take risk mitigations that ensure that everyone has access, mm-hmm. Especially where we live. You live in Sonoma County as I do, and we have a really a vital and vibrant and critically important agricultural community. And I have mixed feelings about how this is approached at large, which often you see people who are not agricultural workers stand up and say, well, what they should and shouldn't do, or shouldn't go to work. And I'm not saying that there isn't some wisdom in there on certain days and in certain ways, but there has to be safeguards if they must or want to, or, have to, or can. We can do better regardless. That's my point.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that there are certain spaces like schools and classrooms where there's a need, and it should just be a basic resource that schools have, where there's going to be, as you say, days where children can't go outside. And so, making sure that those schools have HEPA filters and make sure that what the kids are breathing, daily are as healthy air as possible. And there should be mechanisms to ensure that happens. Yeah.
And it's likely that there are, silver linings of COVID. We have to find them. Otherwise, we're going to live in despair, which means that a lot of companies and schools have been able to increase their ability to filter air through more quickly. But, do we have the data that that's actually reached into every community, especially communities that have been historically marginalized? And it's an open question because I don't know, but I think that it's a question worth asking and then answering at some point. And not you necessarily, not me, but it doesn't mean that we can't ask, I think we can ask for that information and say that we trust that somebody is working on that. But if they're not, hey, there's an opportunity to do equity in this world.
Yep, exactly. And even in Sonoma County, I mean, there are so many really effective and really, I guess, what's the word, like intentional work that community organizations are doing with different demographics, different, with youth and adolescents. And I think that there's ways to harness that partnership as well with community-based organizations to get the message out there around this.
I totally agree. So I understand that in your role with OpenAQ, one of the things that you do is that you have a very global vision of, air quality. And there's a couple of things that I would like to make sure that we include in this podcast. One of them is the availability of low-cost sensors. Like, how do people get those? What's the value of those? Do you have to be an organization? Can you be just a normal person listening to this podcast and want to put one on your house? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so low-cost sensors really has been a game changer in the open air quality data landscape, because this means that we don't have to rely on governments to do the monitoring for us, right? We can actually take it upon ourselves to start monitoring the air that we're breathing in our homes or in our schools, in our neighborhoods. They're all different types of companies. As an organization, we don't particularly, advocate for one over the other, but they are, they're still quite expensive, in that I think the lowest cost is probably $150. And you can, put them up on your wall outside or up on your roof. I think in addition to the low-cost sensor, there's also kind of these handheld air quality monitors as well, which is more mobile. So you can actually take it, on a bike ride or in your car. So technology-wise, it's really opened up a space where there's different types of, devices that you can use to inform yourself and your family of the air quality that you're breathing. And most of these companies make sure that PM 2.5 is included as a pollutant that you can measure.
That's one way too, that for your average, we live in a wildfire affected community and we're surrounded by them as well across the American West. But if you are thinking, maybe I don't have a lot of bandwidth to help out in the world because I've got this job, I've got whatever is going on in your life, which is fine. But just by having a low cost sensor on your home, you are actually helping all the people around you when they go on, they go online and they check OpenAQ and then they're like, oh, okay, I can actually measure it through there. So you are becoming part of the solution, which we will take all progress as perfection. Once again, I will quote Supervisor James Gore, because, that's like his mantra in life. And I love that. Just one idea, because it's funny, there is another company that their sensor is a little bit expensive. And every time we have a wildfire event here or near us, people will go online and they'll be like, well, that's so random that, it's actually my in-law's neighbor has a really nice one, my mother-in-law and my father-in-law. Mm-hmm. Like, what is this one doing on Nut Tree Lane? That's just very random to them. But what it is that it was important for that family due to certain health issues that they had, that they had that air quality sensor right there. But, anybody can do that. There's many things that all of us can do to make just a little bit easier as we move through the world. That's all. So I appreciate that conversation. So, part of me wants to nerd out and just talk to you about, like, what differences did you see during COVID, and how much we all loved seeing the changes in the air quality and the improvement, while we were all in lockdown. But that's going to be another podcast. So I just want to save that one for later. I really want to thank you for being along in this collaborative journey towards, something better and addressing our climate and human-induced issues. I believe that in Wildfire, there isn't enough understanding of the impact of air quality as an issue that affects our health globally, that it disproportionately affects people of color, and is, in my mind, an opportunity for us to do better. And so I want to thank you so much for being a colleague, a board member, and on the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jennifer. It's always a pleasure speaking with you. And, I think that your thought leadership and commitment to the space and really trying to expand the reach of people who it's affecting is really important. And just really believe that after the fire, the heart really is in the work. And so just really appreciate what the organization has done up to this point, and really excited about following and guiding around next steps for the organization.
Oh, good. Me too, because I am convinced that the more talent that we bring forth to the table, and the more of a 360 view of how we get through this is really going to be the secret to our success, and that we're going to win if we all get to the other side of this together, and that we have a healthier and less vulnerable American West. So once again, this has been the podcast, How to Disaster, where we help you recover, rebuild, and reimagine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on the podcast, How to Disaster. For more information, please visit our website at afterthefireusa.org. And if you liked this video, please hit subscribe.
Fannie Mae provides mortgage options for you and your family. If you have a mortgage owned by Fannie Mae, you may have financial options available after a disaster, such as forbearance plans, deferral of payments, lending assistance, and counseling. Find out more from our Disaster Response Network. Go online at www.knowyouroptions.com/relief or call 1-877-833-1746 today.